Welcome to everyone who's joining us on our non-named, unnamed, undescript, unknown Wednesday study session that's been going on now for close to 10 years. We should have some sort of anniversary or something. Welcome to everyone who's joining us. Welcome, of course, to any first-time watchers, whether you're on Zoom or on YouTube. I think Mackenzie's here. We got people from 4 different states. We usually get about 10 people during Zoom, and we'll get another 10 or 15 on YouTube later. We are going to have our Wednesday session, looks like every Wednesday this month. There was going to be cancellation in August at the end, but I think we are going to have it. There's a Comic-Con, which is Dragon Con in Atlanta, which is a big sci-fi convention. It starts on Wednesday, but I don't think it's going to be feasible for us to get babysitters for Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. So we're just going to go for 2 days for the conference. We're hoping to get there so we can see William Shatner, but they haven't released the date everybody's going to be there. So hopefully we'll catch him. He's like the main person we want to see. My wife is a huge Trekkie. So we're here to study. So good to see all of you. I've seen most of you recently. Noel, it's great to see you from Houston. So what we're going to study today is a continuation of the history of Jewish communities in Europe. We're going to look at the Jews of Amsterdam and Netherlands, Belgium, and Denmark, and talk a little about the history of Jews there. A lot of similarities in time periods, but a lot of differences. It's interesting the differences between Amsterdam, Belgium, and Denmark when they're pretty close to each other, but they have very similar immigration patterns, but because of the countries, because of who was in control, because of this and that, there's a lot of different histories between them, some of which we know, some of we don't, and we'll go over a little bit of all of it. But, and again, a lot of you will probably have some knowledge. Does anybody have family comes from any of these countries? I have one grandfather from the Netherlands, from Amsterdam. We don't know anything about him. He left and he went into the, what's it called? The when you're on the ships, but you're working for the country, but you're not in the military.
Merchant Marine.
Merchant Marines. Thank you, Larry. He just couldn't come out. He was a Merchant Marine. Tough little guy. He was like 5 feet on his tippy toes and was just always brawling, apparently. So let's talk first then about the Jews of Netherlands, and especially about Amsterdam, because this, of course, is one of the central locations of Jews for a very long period of time, a significant period of time. There's still Jews there, obviously. But in terms of Jews in Europe, it is one of the major centers of Jewish life in Europe, which is very strange because it's a smaller country than, say, England or France or Spain, but the history there is very vibrant, as we know. And I think all of us are familiar with some of it. But let's look at a little bit of the history there. As with Denmark and Belgium, they have very similar early histories in that we have very little records of Jews being there early on. Obviously, we know there must have been some Jews who were there during the Roman period in Netherlands, but there's really no evidence until maybe the 11th century. So only about 1,000 years ago that there's basic, and this, the funny thing about being Jews is a lot of the history of Jews comes when there are edicts kicking Jews out. So the first history of Jews in the Netherlands is edicts of Jews being kicked out. So obviously if you're kicking Jews out, there's most likely Jews there. Although we do at times they did kick Jews out who weren't there. So 11th century, early days of Jews. In the 13th century, there is history of small Jewish communities, 13th and 14th century. As we all know, the mid 14th century was a terrible time to be Jewish, obviously, because of the Black Death, and it was vibrant in terms of the anti-Semitism against Jews in this area in the 13th and especially 14th century. So there are records of blood libel, persecution, and Jews being murdered and burnt at the stake. But as we know, things will change. So by the time Jews start to move into what we know as the Amsterdam of understanding and support for Jews, there were really no Jews. So up until the time the Jews started going there because they were welcome, there were really no Jews in the Netherlands for maybe 100 to 200 years. So in many areas. But in the 15th century and 16th century, and especially the 17th century, we're going to see Jews starting to move to the Netherlands for a variety of reasons. The number one reason Jews moved to Amsterdam or the Netherlands, obviously, is because they're kicked out of Spain and they're kicked out of Portugal. The problem is, of course, that Spain controls the Netherlands for a short period of time in the 16th century. So you see Jews moving to these areas after they're kicked out of Spain in 1492 and after they're kicked out of Portugal and a few years later, but it's not in large numbers. The first major figure was a man named Francisco Mendes, who opened a big bank in, of course, Antwerp, which is not here, but really adds to this. And so we finally start seeing Jews moving in the mid to late 16th century to the Netherlands, especially Amsterdam, as it becomes more and more of a world power. So we don't see a lot of it beforehand, but basically once Amsterdam separates itself, once the Netherlands, most of it separates itself from the Spanish Empire in the late 16th century, this provides obviously an opportunity for Jews to move there. So this is when you think of Jews moving to Amsterdam and becoming a major power in the Netherlands, you think late 16th century, early 17th century. And really the early 17th century, Jews start moving there in droves. And finally, an official edict was sent out in 1619 that Jews were given a lot of rights. They weren't necessarily citizens, but they were there and had political rights. They didn't have to live in ghettos. And what is the reason Jews were allowed to come into the Netherlands? Is because the Netherlands, like so many other places, needed skills. It's a burgeoning economic power, and they need people with skills. And you have all of these Jews and conversos, Jews who are pretending to be Christian, who a lot of people knew were Jews, who have a lot of skills in commerce, in banking, and in trading. They have connections with North Africa. They're opening trade routes. They're really have skills that are desperately needed, and that's why they're allowed to go. And so this is what we see in the Sephardic Jews. And the difference, though, in the Netherlands was they became more and more open and allowed Jews to go into a wide variety of professions. It's kind of another golden age. We hear about the golden age of Spain. The 17th and 18th centuries is kind of like the golden age of Jews in the Netherlands. They could become doctors. And when they were doctors, they could, like in Spain, treat non-Jews. There were Jews who were shareholders in the East Indies Company. They were in the diamond business, as we know. They were in sugar and tobacco and printing and all the things we think about. They lived at times in a Jewish quarter. At times they didn't, but when they were in the Jewish quarter, they were free to come in and out. There was very little anti-Semitism during this period in Netherlands because the Jews were very philanthropic, they were dedicated, they were very well liked and very helpful. In fact, who is the most famous painter of the age who used to go into the ghetto? You see the paintings all over the place? Rembrandt. See Rembrandt all over the place painting Jews. I mean, that's some of his most famous paintings are Jews. He wasn't Jewish, or we don't know if he was Jewish or not. So these were generally wealthy Jews who had skills that they brought with them. Now, they may not have come in necessarily wealthy at first because obviously they may have left Spain with everything behind, but they came in with really essential skills, and that really helped the Amsterdam as a city and Holland as a country develop into what it would become. And so they were very appreciative of the Sephardic Jews who helped build this country. And to this day, you see, if you go there, you will still see, I mean, there's still the Jewish ghetto area. There's, I think, one synagogue there still there. Most people don't live there. It's mostly a museum area now. But you still see the Jews, although they weren't as supportive during the Holocaust, but Jews were still very much a part of the community and appreciated for how they helped Amsterdam and Netherlands become a power, and again, very little anti-Semitism. So this is due to the Sephardic Jews. Now, of course, things change, and the biggest change is going to start in the 17th century and then continue late 17th century, 18th century, when other Jews are going to move to this area. The difference is it is very similar to everywhere else. In America, you had the Sephardic Jews here first, and then all of a sudden the German Jews came, and they were considered, they weren't as wealthy, and the Sephardic Jews helped them, but didn't really want them in their synagogues. Then you had the German Jews, more famously, and who were a small but very philanthropic, wealthy population. And then you had these millions of Eastern European Jews that they wanted to help, but didn't want them in their synagogue, but they wanted to help. So in the 17th, 18th century, you have a lot of Eastern European and German Jews who are Ashkenazic moving into Amsterdam especially, but also to the Netherlands. And so the only reason really they're allowed to move into these areas is because the Sephardic Jews who lived there promised to take care of them. So obviously religiously they were different. Obviously you have more of the upper middle classes versus lower class in terms of financially, but they did get permission for these who were mostly, escaping persecution to move into the area. And even though, ironically, was very little anti-Semitism from the outside world, there were a lot of issues inside the Jewish community, which of course never happens today. It was a rare time in history where not all Jews got along. But you had different Sephardic groups, you had different Ashkenazic groups, and unusual pairings in these days. And so it became very strange because you had the Ashkenazic Jews, but not all, you had the Polish and the German Jews mostly, and they're very different. You have the Sephardic Jews, some who are more religious, some who are less religious. You have, of course, the Messianic movement of the 17th century with Shabtai Tzvi, which was, of course, he claimed to be the Messiah. You had also all these Jews coming in from, most of them coming from the Chmelnytsky uprising, where so many Jews were killed. And so you have all this going on in the 17th century. You have the Jews who believed that Shabtai Tzvi was the Messiah even after he died, arguing with those who thought he was a heretic because he converted to Islam. You have Baruch Spinoza, one of the great philosophers of the age, who is excommunicated several times, let back in. And again, you have a lot of issues between those who are more traditional, less traditional. And so this is all going on, and during the 17th and 18th century. But during this period, of course, Jews there are thriving, especially in comparison to a lot of other places, because the Netherlands is thriving. Larry.
Rabbi, it brings to mind, we were in Amsterdam quite a few years ago, and I remember we visited many of the large synagogues there. And one of the exhibits that they had talked specifically about what you're talking about, was that the Jews were not only accepted, but so willing to get into and be integrated into the society there, that these were not the Jews that you think of as being separatists, that were coming there to form a Jewish community, almost like Jews coming from Eastern Europe that were coming to the United States and wanted, community of their own, but they wanted to be part of this community. They wanted to be integrated, almost like you think of, them being, assimilated
Right.
very, very quickly. And they say that was basically what saved the Jewish religion in Amsterdam.
Yeah.
And this was well prior to the Reform movement, right? In Germany.
This is prior to the Reform movement. This is prior to the Orthodox movement. This is prior to any movement.
So, yeah, the point that they were trying to make is that these people were probably responsible in some respect for the Reform movement, in that they were so willing to integrate into the community, and that even though they were not, what we consider to be the formal Reform movement, which was Germany, I guess, right?
Well, it started officially in Germany, but really takes hold more in America.
Yeah. Okay. But this was, but these people were almost practicing. So what kind of religion were they practicing? You say were their rituals pretty much, were they changing their practices, their traditions?
Well, first off, you have to remember it's a very similar case to what was going on in Spain. Jews were very integrated to society in Spain, the Sephardic Jews. And so when they came to Amsterdam and to the Netherlands at large, they had a history of being very integrated. It makes a huge difference when you move from one place to another. If you are integrated into society, what does that mean? That means you speak the mother tongue of a language. So you're speaking Spanish, you're willing to learn Dutch, you're willing to learn French. You probably already speak French. It means you have skills outside of Judaism. You have skills like marketing, trading. You understand the language of the land. Like if somebody comes from Eastern Europe, you don't understand what America's about at all. Whereas if you go from America to Europe today, I mean, there's some different things, but you're still modern Western people. So this is akin to modern Western people moving from one country, Western country, to another Western country. It's an educated group moving to another educated place. So when they move there, you have some who just give up religion entirely, and others just go to synagogue and will do some of the trappings. You have to remember, in the Sephardic world, they never had a reform. There's still never been a reform movement in the Sephardic world. In the Sephardic world, if you go to service to a synagogue, it is an Orthodox synagogue. They never created the liberal religion that the Ashkenazic did. So if you're Sephardic, you're either religious or you're not. If you go to services, you go to Orthodox synagogue, that doesn't mean you keep kosher and all these things. You may just go to the Orthodox synagogue when you want to go to services. But you go to the Orthodox synagogue because there is no Sephardic reform or conservative or reconstructionist. It just never happened. Number two, the Sephardic outside of Israel is a very small percentage, although it began as the majority, if not all, of the Jews of the Netherlands in the 16th and century. When the Ashkenazics started moving in, they just overwhelmed them in numbers. So it became the largest Jewish community by far would become the Ashkenazic. And ironically, the Ashkenazic is where it would create the different movements within the religion. So again, they did not have what you would say officially a liberal synagogue where they changed the liturgy and did all these things. It didn't really probably happen. You either went to the Orthodox or you didn't go. Now, by the 18th century, late 18th century, 19th century, the Amsterdam Jewish community had become impoverished because Netherlands ceased to be the economic power. France catches up, England catches up, Germany had already been there. So they become a much smaller economy as all of these other countries start to take over. Just think about America and South America. How many places were controlled by, the Dutch in the 18th century and late 19th century, late 18th century and 19th century? Pretty much very little, very few. They had several wars with France, which really hurt them. So by the 19th century, most of the Jews there were probably living in poverty, and of course, things would change with Napoleon Bonaparte coming in and emancipation, and things would start to get better in the 1800s. But really, for a good portion of the 1800s and late 1700s, a lot of Jews were very poor, and it was not a very powerful country anymore. That would change as the 19th century went on. Netherlands would get more of its luster back. They would start to become more of a national or international power in the cotton industry and the diamond industry and other places that we know of today. And Jews just kind of stayed there the whole time. So as you can imagine, as times got worse, you imagine probably that the anti-Semitism increased as the Jewish community went from a philanthropic, useful Sephardic community to a poorer, less skilled Ashkenazic community. The Jews were probably appreciated less and less. And today, obviously, it's mostly an Ashkenazic community, although there's still, there's still Sephardic Jews there. So as of the Holocaust, there were 80,000 Jews in the Netherlands. Most of them, obviously, in the big cities, especially Amsterdam. 80% of the Jews of the Netherlands died in the Holocaust. So 80% of 80,000. So a very high percentage akin to the other areas that were of the worst. So some did flee and escape, as we know, but many did not, if not most. Now, today, any questions, by the way? All right, so again, 20% survived the Holocaust. Not all of them stayed in the country. But today, there's still a Jewish community in the area. It's pretty small. I think, I forgot, I looked up how many people are in the Netherlands today. There's about, let's see, how many Jews are there today? I just forgot the number, sorry. Let's see here. It is, oh my goodness. There's like, 40,000 Jews in the Netherlands, I think, now. 25 to 30,000 Jews in the Netherlands, 40,000 Jews maybe in the Netherlands, and maybe 30,000 of them in Amsterdam, something like that. And so there is pluses and minuses to the country. Golden Age, one of the great places in time for Jews to live in the end of the 16th, but especially 17th and early 18th century. Sephardic Jews were connected as in very few places. Obviously, you have the Golden Age of Spain, you have America today, But except for those two, or the world today, except for that, if you want to be a Jew in history and you're not in the modern era, you probably want to live in Spain, 10th, 11th century, or in Amsterdam, 17th century. Those are two places you probably want to live, or in a few places in the Muslim world as well. There is anti-Semitism now there, obviously. A lot of it has to do with, as it always is, with the Palestinian issue. The anti-Israel is the anti-Semitism in the Netherlands today, as with everywhere else. The Netherlands has often been very friendly to the U.S., to Israel. They supported the partition. They support tourism of the Jewish area, of course, and obviously one of the most famous Jewish landmarks in the world is there, the Anne Frank House. Obviously, there are people who tour there because of the history. Baruch Spinoza, of course, is one of the great Jewish and considered philosophers of all time, not just Jewish, but any. So many of us have been there. So it's, a really great history for a large portion. It is surprising that they were not more able to protect Jews during the Holocaust. We'll talk a little bit about that. But they did do a lot. So a lot more than people realize. For whatever reason, the Germans were much more aggressive in the Netherlands than some of the other countries. And so there is only one country that has more righteous among the nations than the Netherlands. So that, of course, is by Yad Vashem says Reich is people, Reich, and so number one is Poland, because obviously there were more Jews in Poland than everywhere else, but number two is in the Netherlands. So they are the number two place with the righteous among. So yes, Larry.
Rabbi, once again, thinking back in our trip to Amsterdam in the Netherlands, a lot of Indonesian restaurants in Amsterdam, and apparently that was one of their major colonies. And Indonesia, I was surprised to find out, is probably the largest Muslim population in the world.
Yeah,
not Arab, but Muslim.
Yeah, I think it's number one, or either that, or it's that, and I think India.
But what is your sense of anti-Semitism now in the Netherlands? Is you don't hear much about
well, you don't hear much about the Netherlands at all. Anti-Semitism in the Netherlands is very similar to other places right now. It is higher than it has been. As with lots of Europe, a lot of it is in the Muslim community, but not just in the Muslim community. I don't know if the Muslim community is as big there as some of the other places like Belgium or France, but anti-Semitism is on the rise, unfortunately, as in everywhere else. There's a lot of governmental and non-governmental stereotypes, but the Dutch government often does support Israel and often breaks with the Palestinians. Again, all of this it's an ever free-flowing thing, but obviously within the Muslim world, especially in Europe, anti-Semitism is rising at astronomical rates, and they view Israel as a really terrible entity, unfortunately. But again, as times change, as Israel becomes closer with Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Egypt, and this anti-Iran campaign, who knows what's going to happen? Certainly, Israel's stature in these countries has risen in the last few years. So we'll see if that translates. But Western Europe especially is a very, the Jews are persecuting the Palestinians area, even though that may or may not be true, depending on how you look at it, but that's what it seems. So a lot of the Muslims in Western Europe and a lot of people in Western Europe, more than in most places, think that Jews are trying to take over the world and are trying to take over. So that kind of stereotype is definitely increasing, unfortunately. So it's, again, as we're everywhere else, when you hear anti-Israel sentiment, usually it's anti-Semitism. Now, we always have to say, oh, 1 second, Michael, the difference between criticizing Israel and criticizing Israel's right to exist. And those are two big, I criticize Israel. You guys criticize Israel, no big deal, but others criticize it in a way that is really anti-Semitic. Michael.
This is kind of, I don't know why anybody would know the answer to this, but, you're talking about the Ashkenaz and the Sephardic and the merging of them. And it just triggered a thought from way back when. But in the Dutch Jews who are kosher, they only wait an hour after eating meat before they can eat dairy. And I don't know why anybody would know how this came about, but I'll ask.
Well, I don't know exactly how, it's anything from an hour to 6 hours.
Right.
And it's usually dependent upon where your family was in the 15th, 16th, 14th century. So I don't know exactly why they do an hour there particularly. But some of it a lot of it is just family tradition and they don't know the exact reason. Others are based upon specific rabbinical authorities who have done this. Now, not everybody in the Netherlands believes it's 1 hour, by the way. There are a high percentage who believe it's longer. But again, it just depends on who your background and how it became in each individual way. I don't know. I don't know why in some places it is 1 hour exactly versus some places it's more. Most places say 6 hours though. That's by far the most popular one, I think. But that'd be a question. How do we go? That's something I can look up to see why is it 1 hour in some places and 6 hours in another exactly. Some would say it's basically, the 6 hour rule is basically it's a mealtime rule. That's why 6 hours. It's 6 hours-ish from lunch to dinner. That's mainly the reason for that. So you're not going to have dairy till your next meal. So could it be the other way from a breakfast to lunch thing? Maybe. That's a good question.
Rabbi?
It just depends on how hungry I am. That's how I decide. Larry.
Rabbi, on another sort of tangential subject, I was reading a little bit about the American Revolution and the financing of the American Revolution. And France, of course, was a very, very big financier. And, probably without France, we couldn't have, survived the revolution. But I was really surprised to find that the Netherlands was also a very big financier.
Oh, really?
And I think Franklin went over there when he was in England, and he went over there to secure, loans from them. But did you know much about it? Were there any Jewish bankers that, since they were in the banking industry in general, you hear about Chaim Solomon and
Right.
William Morris and, the ones in the United States, but I don't know whether or not
That's a
the
good question.
financiers, I meant to look that up.
We can look that up. I think, by the time of the American Revolution, the Netherlands were not quite the power financially they had been. So I assume they wanted, this is a burgeoning market. They don't own any of the property. So if they can get in on it, which they do, and it does help them in the future, I can see why they would want to do that. I don't know. I don't know if there are any there still were Jewish bankers by the time. We'd have to look into that. That's a good question.
It's certainly not the Rothschilds or of that caliber, I don't think, but
I could be. I don't know. That's a good question.
Yeah.
One thing before we finish on the Netherlands, and this will be a direct intro. There is one area or one city of the Netherlands called Limburg, if you haven't heard of it, in which they protected all of their Jews as much as they could. So they tried to save all of the Jews, and they saved most of them. It was a conglomerated effort by the city to save 2,000 Jews. And not only that, Jews went through Limburg from Spain to Switzerland when they were trying to survive the Holocaust. So they saved, I think, over 90% of the Jews. It's actually probably higher than 90%. They saved 90% of the Jews who went through there, but a higher percentage of the Jews who were there at the start of the war because other Jews were going through there. So they consciously were able to do this. A small little town where everybody knew each other, and they all, through peer pressure, basically saved 90% of the Jews who went through that area. And so that was, I think, really a good transition, because we'll come to Belgium next, but I want to go to Denmark, because Denmark in the Jewish world, we'll talk a little bit about the history, but what is Denmark really known for in the Jewish world?
The king wearing a patch.
Right, and exactly during when? During what? During World War II. Denmark, this small little country in Scandinavia, close to Scandinavia, in there, right up there. I mean, they protected almost all of their Jews.
Everybody wanted.
Yeah, there were very few Danish Jews who died in camps. They saved most of them. Most of them who died in camps or transport died on the way before they could be rescued. So it was a very small number. They saved almost all of their Jews, sending them to Sweden. The king is famous for wearing a patch, which is actually an urban legend. He never did. That's an urban legend we all thought was true. They may have said, if you make us do this, you make the Jews do this, I will wear a patch. He may have said that, but he never actually wore one. But he did protect all of the Jews of Denmark against the Nazis. And remember, again, Denmark is not a powerful country. They cooperated with the Nazis in terms of they realized they were not going to stop the Nazis when they gave very little military effort to stop them, realizing they were going to lose, and they agreed to cooperate with them in full, except for this. And basically, the Nazis didn't want to press it because they needed Denmark for certain things, especially food. But it is a symbol of strength that this small little country, just by standing up, were able to keep the Nazis from killing the Jews in their country, because they simply said, we're not going to do it. That's all they did, basically. We'll cooperate with you in every other way. We're not going to give you our Jews. That's basically what they did. Not militarily, although they did have a strong resistance movement that helped, but that was later on when the Nazis were fading. That famous, the famous Danish resistance movement really came into strength in the late 1943, 44, when all of a sudden it became apparent that the Nazis might lose this war. So
Rabbi,
yes.
wasn't there also a very famous flotilla of Danish ships that went from?
Oh yeah.
There's a museum, I believe, in Denmark dedicated to these Danish merchant marine kind of people that went and
fishing boats, trains. They used anything they could.
Scandinavian countries.
Exactly. They did anything. Now, so let's go over a little bit of history of them, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the saving of the Jews during the Holocaust, because Denmark was not known as much of a Jewish-friendly country as Netherlands was. So again, there probably were Jews in Denmark earlier on, but the first evidence of Jews are not, and we're talking 1600s. So it's really not till, we know it's famous for, Shakespeare plays and that stuff, but there really weren't known Jewish community until the 1600s, maybe the 16th century. So it's one of these countries that kicked or forbade Jews to do all these things in the 16th century before there were Jews there. So like Jews are forbidden of doing this, this, and this, but there's no Jewish person in your country, so it's really irrelevant, irreverent, and so what we see is in the 1600s, 17th century, early 17th century, you have the first Jews living there, and it's because the king allowed one Jewish merchant to come to the country. He basically allowed others, because this Jewish merchant, who was Dionys, was his name, Albert Dionys, was very helpful. And so other Sephardic Jews were allowed in the 1600s. Unlike Amsterdam, they did not allow Ashkenazic Jews into the country. Why? Because they didn't have any skills. They allowed the Sephardic skilled people like Amsterdam did, like the Netherlands, except for the Netherlands allowed the Ashkenazic to come in as long as the Sephardim guaranteed they would take care of them. This was not the case in Denmark. They said no Ashkenazic Jews allowed. So as time went on, after a very terrible war, by the end of the 17th century, they were allowing more Jews to come in, even Ashkenazic Jews, because they wanted to encourage trade with those countries where they came from. So, but really, not even 2,000 Jews probably lived in Denmark by the end of the 18th century. So it was there were Jews living in the West Indies areas controlled by the Danes, but there weren't that many Jews. But again, it wasn't a big population. It was a very small population, even compared to the Netherlands. So by the 18th century, Jews are allowed into the country a little bit more, thank you to Napoleon a little bit. And really, as opposed to other countries, it's not really till the 18th century where Jewish life in Denmark starts to thrive. So, and again, it's still a very small population there. And so a couple thousand Jews immigrate there during the various Russian wars. And when they get there, they become very much integrated, as opposed to places like Belgium where they didn't, more like the Netherlands where they did become integrated into society, kind of like America. And they did have Yiddish theater and all that stuff, but they really became integrated. But by the 1920s, like America, Denmark had closed off immigration. So small Jewish community really became part of the Denmark society in the 19th century and 20th century. Started allowing Ashkenazic Jews to come in during these periods, but still a very small population. Would not be well known in the Jewish world at all. I mean, we're talking a couple thousand Jews, not a long history. And if it wasn't for this incredible act during World War II, we would not know anything. Really, it would be not unknown, but it would not be well known. So what happened in the war? So before the war, already they were starting to show support for the Jewish world in light of Adolf Hitler and him becoming chancellor in 1933. They already had leaders visiting synagogues in opposition to him. And so what we see during the war itself is not surprising in terms of they were already doing this beforehand. All right, so out of the 7,800 Jews in Denmark before the war, 7,220 were saved, plus almost 700 Jewish spouses, non-Jewish spouses of Jews. So, And remember, all the ones who died were not necessarily those who died in camps. They died in other ways as well. Some committed suicide. Some died in transportation. A boat that was rescuing Jews, taking them to Switzerland or Sweden, capsized, and everybody who was on board was killed. So a very small percentage went to the camps and died there. In fact, there were like 460, I think it's 464 Jews were captured and sent to camps, and almost all of them were saved. And those who died often on the transportation as well. So how did this all begin? Now, first of all, the Reich was very happy that Denmark made it easy for them. They didn't have to waste ammunition. They didn't have to waste tanks going all the way up there. They basically said, we're going to acquiesce and we're going to become part, do whatever you need. So it made it very easy for the Germans to be a little bit more generous with the Danish because they had not really done anything to try and stop them. Okay, so it was a very good relationship. The Nazis, when talking about relationships with European countries and how it's supposed to work, Denmark was used as the model. This is how it's supposed to work. And so they gave Denmark a little bit more autonomy in some ways because they were doing whatever. They didn't have to waste Jewish resources, the Nazi resources. So as time went on and the Danes continued to do what they were supposed to do, in every other way, they were given some leeway. When asked about the Jewish question, what was the answer? When they said, you need to hand over the Jews, what's the common answer? The common answer is, there are no Jews in Denmark. We have no Jews here. And that's kind of the answer. We have no Jews here. And if there's no Jews, you can't, do anything. So let's go over some of the specifics about it. Denmark provided a lot of meat and butter to Germany and was considered essential for the war. And so because of this, that helped them do what they were needed to do. Okay? So they also had a very organized resistance that again started really picking up later on. They also refused to allow anti-Semitic newspapers. They refused to allow people to, for instance, bomb any Jewish area without persecution. So if you had any connection to an anti-Semitic crime, you could be persecuted while they were under the control of the Nazis. That's how they did it. They made sure people knew that if you did something, you were going to be prosecuted. So Germany kind of let them do their own thing for a very good amount of time. In fact, there were German diplomats who were not very supportive of Jews generally, who understood that if we want to keep this easy connection with Denmark going, we're going to have to just ignore the Jewish question. And so there were German diplomats who actually told the Jewish leaders what was going on ahead of time. The most famous was a guy named George Ferdinand Duckwitz. But there were others as well. So basically, the way they were able to save Jews is the early alerts. If something was planned to go down, the Jewish community and people who were helping them knew days in advance. And that's how they were able to rescue them. That was the most important piece. So obviously, if Germans went into areas, most of the time they would find nobody. So it was really, that was the key to it. They also worked with the Swedish government, because at first Sweden would not allow Jews in. It was the Danish government and the Danish king that convinced the Swedes to allow Jews to come in, because Sweden was a what do you call it, area. So when the Nazis came to take the Jews on Rosh Hashanah in 1943, Duckwitz had already leaked to the Jewish community this was happening, and of course, on a day that the Nazis thought everybody was going to be in services or with the family, there was nobody there and they had already left. People know, I think that's pretty well known. You have people like Niels Bohr. Has everybody heard of Niels Bohr? Probably the most famous Dane of this Jewish Dane of this time. Obviously, he was given leave to leave the country by the Swedish king himself. And when he got to Sweden, they wanted to send him to America immediately to go start helping out with the Manhattan Project, the secret Manhattan Project, but he refused to leave Sweden also until the Swedes gave permission for the Jews to come into the country. Some think he had a major part to play. Others think he didn't. But eventually the Jews were smuggled out of Denmark into Sweden through a wide range of areas. Freight cars and ferries were, of course, the two biggest ones. And some of the unfortunate Danes charged a lot of money to do this. So the Jews had to come up with a lot of money, but the Danish government actually came up with a lot of the money as well. So it wasn't just the Jews. I think the number is about 50-50. So the Jews paid for about 50%, and the Danish government paid for the rest, for the other 50%. So that's a pretty impressive thing. When at times the Gestapo was able to catch, there was one moment in time where the Gestapo was able to capture 80 Jews in one fishing port. Apparently there was a turncoat Danish person. Some of them committed suicide. Some of them were sent to the camps, but even when they went to the camps, the Danes petitioned and convinced the Germans often not to send them to death camps, but to actual concentration camps, and allowed them to send food and supplies to the Jews there who were Danish. So that is how impressive this was, when all these other countries were just giving up and saying, hey, you know, the Germans are more powerful than us. The Danes were able to do all of this without very little military resistance. A couple of key contacts within the German and Danish government is all it took. Negotiations to not kill our captured Jews. Negotiations with Sweden to let them in. You know, individuals willing to give up their time and boats. So it was really incredible how they were able to do this. Now, most famously, I think it was 1944, on October 1st, this was one of the big organizational attempts by the Nazis to take Jews in. And on that day, almost unequivocally, wherever they went, they found no Jews anywhere. And when they did find a couple of Jews here and there was always attempts to bribe them to let the Jews go. And oftentimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. So again, there were a few who were caught and killed, but very few. Now, of the 580 Jews who did not escape Sweden, a lot of them did die. So 464 were taken in, and some of them died, but still a very small percentage. Any thoughts or questions on this? So it has become, Michael.
Okay, just a couple of comments. One, PBS had and I think you can still get it if you remember. They had this wonderful series called Seaside Hotel, which is focused in Denmark, and it goes from the late 20s through World War II, and the evolution of the small groups thinking about Hitler is very, very well done, and things that happened once the war started. It's a wonderful series, regardless.
I'd love to see it. Well, I think, and also, I mean, the most amazing number of all is, there were 7,800 Jews in Denmark before the war started, and now that's 7,800. Only about 100 died in the camps. 100. That's it. Others died, obviously, in other ways, transportation, other issues, but only 100 died in the camps, and that is a very small percentage compared to Netherlands, were 80%. And again, the Netherlands were more famous as a Jewish center than Denmark. By far, the Netherlands, even though not a mass power, were certainly considered more powerful than Denmark. But Denmark was just willing to take the chance.
The other observation I was going to make, I have a very, very good non-Jewish Danish friend who's even older than Larry.
No, really? Wow.
Yeah. And so he grew up in Denmark during the occupation, and I just want to say he never found it to be a very benign experience. You want to get him riled up, you talk about Germans, even to this day.
You talk about what? One more time?
You talk about Germans.
Oh.
I mean, that experience has never left him.
Yeah. And again, it's the whole war. It's, the Holocaust is such a terrible, you see so much about what type of people you are. And again, as we mentioned, it was, the Jews in Denmark, were part of society. They were considered part of Denmark. They were Denmark citizens, and that's, they decided to save their own, and they were very smart because, the Germans who helped the Jews out in Denmark were not necessarily supportive of the Jews. They were supportive of the relationship between Denmark and Germany. I'm in a position of power in Denmark. The Reich has told me to kill all the Jews. However, I know if I do that, I'm going to create a resistance movement. There's going to be food shortages now. We're not going to get our food on time. We're not going to get our butter on time. There's going to be protests. There's going to be paperwork. I may lose my job because everything's not going smoothly. So I have two decisions. I either follow through with this Jewish thing, or I follow through with everything else. And most of them chose the latter, just to ignore the Jewish question and all. There was a very famous German who was, what was his name? Werner Best. He was he was in charge of the roundup and just let everybody just decided not to do it. I mean, that's all it decided, not to do it. That was all that happened. So it's amazing to see what countries like Sweden and Denmark could do, and as opposed to places like France and the Netherlands or Poland. So, but again, there's still Jews in Denmark to this day. Again, it's a very small Jewish population, but it's never really been a large Jewish population. I have never been there. I've always wanted to go there, and I'll get there one of these days. But they're, again, in the country, what is happening is very similar to other places, the Muslim population has grown immeasurably. There's a lot more anti-Semitism now. Unfortunately, it's one of those places that it's growing, but that's happening all over Europe. I don't think it's endemic to Denmark compared to anywhere else. So, but the number is growing, and there's the Jewish population is shrinking. So, but it's unfortunate because the history there, just a single 5-year period or 6-year period of what they did is pretty impressive. So that's a little bit. We won't get to Belgium today, but I think those are two interesting countries. Larry.
Yeah, just a couple of comments. I was a little taken aback by Michael's comment. I thought I was his oldest friend, so but I'm sorry that I'm not any longer.
I'm his best friend. I'm not his
oldest. Best friend. Okay, oldest in a different sense. That, but I just wanted to say that we watched the Cantor Portnoy the other day on the on the YouTube, and it was marvelous. I had forgotten what a wonderful entertainer he was. And what a voice. What a voice, and what a personality. And I just thought it was a beautiful, beautiful service. And then by chance, I forgot to turn off the TV, and it automatically went to the next YouTube, which apparently was one of the services I hadn't seen. And I just wanted to say that I appreciated your comments on the LGBT community in that service. I thought that was very well said, very well spoken.
I appreciate that.
And I just wanted to ask, is there anything happening that we should be up to date on the search for a Cantor?
We are, again, this is if we get a Cantor, it won't be till July 1st of next year. That's how long it takes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so we just are on the start. And again, we're going to do our best. We're getting all the paperwork done, but hopefully we'll get somebody in July 1st. If we don't, we'll continue, and we may look for other areas. But I will say this for Cantor, when Cantor Portnoy was here, a Friday night service, which is, a very small service for us, we had 123 views.
Wow.
Which is like 175 people probably. And on Saturday morning, we had 115 views, which is probably about the same. So, we had probably 300 views, 300 individuals watch his two services, which was pretty impressive.
It's a beautiful service. If you haven't seen it, I would suggest, recommend everybody tune in again and watch it. It was really entertaining and inspirational as well. Yeah, spiritual.
Yeah, and this week we've got I think Mac and Jessica are singing are playing this week.
Good.
This week.
And I noticed you're going to be doing a talk before Tisha B'Av.
I am. I'm on Tisha B'Av evening, 8 o'clock. A group of synagogues and rabbis are going to be getting together to have a Tisha B'Av program at 8 o'clock. We didn't get that out to the community because I just got the Zoom link now, and Jennifer's out, so I'm going to have to see if I can figure it out.
Oh, okay, great. But, okay. So it's not only Mikvah Israel. It's
no. I'm just doing a 10-minute study session. That'll be the best part of it, obviously. But
okay.
But for next week, we have completely participatory. I'll do very little preparation except for what I know already. Best Jewish places to visit. So I want people to bring what are some of the best, some obvious, some less obvious places you have visited as a Jew. So in other words, obviously we love going to places, but talk about the Jewish aspects of, we went to Mongolia, which is great. Who doesn't want to go to Mongolia? Michael and I have talked for years about going to Mongolia together. But it would be about the Jewish aspects of Mongolia. What are some of the really interesting places you've enjoyed? Obviously, Israel is so obvious, but, if we can pick other places.
New Jersey is obviously at the top.
Obviously, New Jersey.
New Jersey has got to be at the top of the list.
New Jersey is, but I would go with foreign countries mostly.
Oh, foreign countries.
Yeah, if you want to do stuff in the States as well. So let's stick to foreign countries for next time, and then maybe we'll do in the States as well the time after. So next week, bring stories about places in the world you've gone as a Jewish traveler and really found incredible experiences, places like Morocco or, in places in Europe, Netherlands, maybe one talking about Anne Frank's house or going to see the Sephardic synagogue that's still in the old ghetto. or some people may have something, going to Curacao and seeing the synagogue there. I've never been there, but I hear it's really quite stunning. Right, but it's such a pleasure to be teaching with all you guys again. Hopefully we'll start up some new study sessions coming up, and hope everyone is doing well. Thank you again for joining us, Arnold and Mackenzie, or Mac. Thank you, Larry and Jane. Good to see you, Arlene, and Flossie and Ron and Michael. And I don't know where Noel went, but she was here for most of it, or at least part of it. All our best to those in Texas. Mac, did you have a question? Or are you just putting the clap?
No, I was just clapping.
All right, thanks, Matt. And we're going to see about the stuff we talked about later. All right. So thank you, guys. It has been an absolute pleasure as always. I'll see you next week. So bring your stories next week because I'm preparing nothing.
Okay. Rabbi, thank you so much.
So little preparation. It's just going to be like turn on and let's do it.
Okay.
All right, you guys. Stay safe, everyone.
Thank you.
You guys. And don't
Again,
forget,
everybody.
if you're
Bye-bye.
coming in,
Take care,
Seersucker
everybody.
Shabbat Saturday morning, Seersucker Shabbat Saturday morning, and Tisha B'Av